Uh, Hello, everyone. As per our usual, I'm going to wait about a minute as I don't know if all the participants are admitted at once or if it takes a minute, which is what it shows on my screen. Already have something in the chat. We're here now. Okay, so Dwayne Day, thank you very much, Dwayne. I am glad you're on this talk. Welcome, everyone. I'm Walter Gordon, chairman of the AIAA Niagara Frontier section, joined by Dr. John Chryssidis and Dr. Asif Siddiqi, who I will introduce in a moment. Some brief bookkeeping first. Hopefully you see my screen here with upcoming meetings in the Niagara Frontier section. Next month on March 8th, Gilles Leclerc, Director General of Space Exploration at CSA, is going to talk about the Canadian Space Exploration Program. April 14th, Ray Harvey is the Mission Operations Manager for the DART mission at Johns Hopkins APL. People who've been a member of the Niagara Frontier section for a long time. We've heard Alice Bowman speak twice in Western New York about New Horizons. Ray Harvey is her counterpart on DART, and we're very much looking forward to hearing him speak in April. And then May 10th, Dr. Michael Bonanno, he is the X-59 air vehicle lead at the Skunk Works, is going to talk about the development of the X-59, the quiet supersonic technology X-plane. Some ROE for this evening. I suggest you select single speaker during the talk so you're not looking at Dr. Chryssidis and my blank screens while Dr. Siddiqi is talking. And please submit questions via the Q&A tab, not via the chat. Feel free to chat, but submit questions via the Q&A so we can keep them straight, and Dr. Siddiqi will take those questions at the end of the talk. If you have any comments or questions or requests after the talk is over, later tonight, tomorrow, next week, the email of the Niagara Frontier section is nf.aiaa@gmail.com. It is not readgolf@aiaa.org, which is where you got your registration link from. So please take note of this email address. And with that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Siddiqi. I'm not going to go over his bio. You all saw it in the flyer you received. But I will say I have been looking forward to this talk for at least 2 years. He is one of the foremost experts on the Soviet space program in the world. It's not for me to say, perhaps the foremost expert. And I think we're going to have a fantastic talk tonight. So Dr. Siddiqi, it's all yours.
Thank you, Walter. I hope you guys can hear me. If not, wave your hands. And everybody can see my the first slide there. Okay, well, thank you to the AIAA Niagara Frontier section for the invitation. Thank you to Walter. Thank you to everybody who's watching. So my talk today, as you see from the title, is the Cold War Space Race, the Soviet Reach for the Moon. It's a topic that I've been interested in for a really long time, and I've written a lot about it, but I thought it would be fun to revisit it now, many years after I first wrote about it. My talk is really organized in three sections. The first section, I'll just give some brief history of the Soviet space program and how it works and what was sort of the general context of the moon program. So it's not going to be about the moon program in specific, but it's going to be about the larger context. Second part is about the moon program. That's the lengthiest part of it. We'll talk about the rockets, the technology, the programs, etc. And the third part is a little bit of the afterward and sort of collecting my thoughts and maybe reflecting on what it all means, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's see, let's get this off. So some background to the Soviet space program for those who are not familiar with any of it. The space program emerged out of the Soviet ballistic missile program right after World War II. And much like as in the United States, the Soviet missile development, ballistic missile development was an outgrowth of German technology. Particularly the V2 shown here. Of course, not as in the US, not all of it came out of the V2 technology, but a large portion of it did come out of German technology, including the V2. And after World War II, the country was devastated. The Soviets under Stalin tried to develop delivery systems for their atomic bomb. They exploded their first atomic bomb in 1949. So there was a large debate over whether bombers or missiles would be more effective for that goal. And what they ended up doing was they developed a very effective intercontinental ballistic missile called the R-7 ICBM, which is often nicknamed the Semyorka, which is the number 7. And it was the sort of first major large-scale technological system in the Soviet space program. They developed in the 1950s. They used a cluster booster concept, wrapping 4 boosters around a core. This should be very familiar to those of you who watched any kind of Soyuz launch, because this basic design still exists with us to this day. The basic ICBM in the 50s used liquid oxygen kerosene, about 400 tons of thrust. The idea was to deliver a 3 metric ton nuclear warhead about 8,000 kilometers. And in developing this ICBM, they managed to really cultivate a kind of culture of working very large projects. There was large cooperation in applied sciences, in engineering, and of course production, because they had to actually build these ICBMs in factories. All of it was extremely secret. So that was the other thing that came out of the ICBM program, was the culture of extreme secrecy in the Soviet space program. Now, the person normally we associate with the Soviet space program, perhaps somebody you've also heard about, their engineering chief, if you will, was a man named Sergei Pavlovich Korolev. Korolev is, in many ways, his name is synonymous with the early days of the Soviet space program. He was known as the chief designer, so to speak. Here he's shown at this picture is from 1953, so he was about 50 or so, and he was an ambitious aeronautics engineer. I mentioned aeronautics because that's where he sort of cut his teeth in aeronautics, not in astronautics. He also survived Stalin's Gulag, which I'll come back to in a little bit. He was arrested in 1938 for supposedly sabotaging their rocket program, and he spent about 6 years in prison, one of which was in an actual labor camp out in Siberia, digging for gold. And he suffered quite a lot as a result. After the war, once he was released, he headed the ballistic missile program. And but more relevant to our story, more than missiles, he began to form an informal coalition of like-minded people who were space enthusiasts. Now, in the 1950s, space was not a particularly interesting or sort of a high priority for the Soviet government. So much of this work was rather informal. They wrote reports, they talked to each other about how to start a space program. And in many ways, the space race that we know of actually began before, in the mid-50s, I argue, that sort of the reach for space. Korolev and many other scientists were beginning to do satellite research by the early 1950s. Already they were issuing reports about what a satellite could do. These studies were being done in military institutes. And the goal at the time was really to what could a satellite do? How could it help our national security, so to speak? And spy satellites was a big priority at the time. But all of this was happening without too much support. But then something happened, which was on July 29th, 1955, the United States government announced that it would launch a satellite for the International Geophysical Year, which was coming up in 1957, which was an international program for studying the Earth and its environment. And the Eisenhower administration made that announcement, and it was quite well publicized. And within a week, in fact, exactly a week later, on August 5th, Korolev authors a letter directly to the Politburo saying that, would you grant me some resources to launch a satellite? Meaning, euphemistically, basically, I would need one of these ICBMs to do it. And a few days later, the Politburo met on this issue. They actually met on a number of other issues, but this was on the agenda that day, and they approved it. This was on August 8th, 1955. So really about 10 days after the US announcement. And this is the document, the actual approval of Sputnik, which was under in the early 2000s, and I circled, it's in Russian, but you can sort of tell the date, 8th August 1955, and the Cyrillic in the second larger red circle says, basically, we approve the idea of an artificial satellite of the Earth. And that essentially sets off the Soviet space program. And there's a lot of detail, which I'm going to skip over. But the key moment is, of course, the launch of Sputnik on October 4th, 1957. Here you can see Sputnik, which is really, I think, quite an elegant design for a first satellite. There's not much to it, but I think it's quite evocative. And of course, as many of us know, Sputnik caused kind of a panic in the United States. This is the New York Times headline from October 5th, which is the day after Sputnik was launched. Soviet fires Earth satellite into space. It is circling the globe at 18,000 miles per hour. Sphere, and more ominously, sphere tracked in 4 crossings over US. So there's a kind of, there's both a thrill and excitement of space and a little bit of a fear. And I think that really characterizes much of the early days of the space race. The peak of the early days of the Soviet space program is, of course, past Sputnik, you get into human spaceflight. And the first launch of a human being into space in 1961, the launch of Yuri Gagarin on April 12th, 1961, which is an unqualified first in human spaceflight, or in spaceflight generally. And this kind of first is actually not a lone data point. The Soviet Union was really sort of firing on all cylinders. And as I was preparing this talk, I just sort of wrote down some of the firsts they accumulated in the early days. The first living organism in space, of course, the space dog Laika, the first human-made object to impact another celestial body, a lunar probe that impacted the moon in 1959, the first photographs of the far side of the moon in also the same year, the first woman in space in 1963, Valentina Tereshkova, the first 3-person spaceship in 1964, the first spacewalk, many of you know Alexei Leonov, who exited his Voskhod spacecraft that year, the first lunar soft landing and images from the surface of the moon from Luna 9, which was a little probe in 1966, the first human-made object to impact a planet, which was a Soviet probe that impacted Venus, the first human-made object to transmit from the surface of a planet, also from Venus in 1970, first Mars orbit, first Mars impact, and first Earth orbital space station. So a lot of stuff, and and we can go into that in a later Q&A. But the question that remains often, I as a historian, I'm interested in why these successes, because I think so much of the Soviet space program has been about why the failures. And one of my goals in writing some of the stuff that I did was why the successes, because that's also, as a historian, I'm also interested in that. And the answers to these questions, I think, are relevant later to the moon program. They had a very large skilled engineering workforce coming out of World War II and educated in the 50s, very large. I wouldn't say they were trained in very sort of special disciplines, maybe not quite as elite as elite institutions in the West, but generally well-trained engineering force. They were very good in the basic and applied sciences, mathematics, celestial mechanics, chemistry. They were able to do small, discrete projects under one team without too much systems integration. Now, the R7 ICBM was an example of that in some sense. It does seem like a big project, but it was done completely almost by one team. And so they were able to sort of have complete control over it in a way. They lacked advanced microelectronics, so they had to really bypass that constraint with simple solutions, but I find them rather elegant in some sense, because they were like more oriented towards how can we solve this problem with what we have, right, rather than what we might imagine having in the future. Their engineering style was focused on repetition. So test something out by flying it, basically, over and over and over. And that was possible because resources were quite plentiful in the 50s and 60s. So ground testing was, I think, while important, I think they had this culture of flight testing, which worked in their favor in the early days. They also had a work culture related to devotion and loyalty to their chief designer, which I'll come back to. You talk to these veterans, they're incredibly loyal. They'll stay up night after night after night in order to do the work that their chief designer expects them to do. And that also, I think, played in their favor. And I threw that in. They had an optimism, and maybe that fed into ambition. This is a more sort of contested, maybe, argument, but I do think there was something about that plays into the early successes. They were really ambitious and maybe positive thinking. The Soviet Design Bureau system, I just want to quickly go through it. What does that mean? These are the companies that built the Soviet spacecraft. They're called design bureaus. All Soviet missiles and spacecraft were built by these design bureaus. And they went under the acronym OKB, Opitno Konstrukskoye Bureau, Experimental Design Bureau, which was basically an R&D firm with a pilot production plant. Maybe 5,000 to 10,000 people worked there, but they all work for one person, usually a man. Rarely, I don't think there's ever been a female chief designer. A chief designer who sort of supervises the whole enterprise. And the primary goal of these design bureaus is essentially to make weapons. There's almost no civilian design bureaus. They're really all about weapons for the Soviet military. And in this particular dynamic, civilian space was very much secondary, and we'll come back to that. Now, if you have any kind of cursory familiarity with the Soviet space program, people will talk about all the different chief designers that are fighting with each other. And I do need to introduce a couple of them to tell the story about the moon program. The first one that I did already mention is Sergei Korolev, pretty much the sort of most important chief designer, the one in charge of the largest firm, the one in charge of Sputnik and Gagarin, the R7. He really is, you could really say he's the founder of the Soviet space program. But there was also Valentin Glushko. Why am I bringing him up? He was head of a very large firm that built the rocket engines, and he was a very proud individual and a very erudite and I think scientifically minded individual, much more than Korolev. He really got involved in the nitty-gritty. Glushko built some of the best rocket engines in the world, and some of his engines are, in fact, flying on American rockets still to this day. And Vladimir Chelomey, who was another individual who came out of the aviation industry. He was actually an aerospace engineer, and he was also much more of a fundamental scientist. He was involved in all sorts of propulsion research early on. When he comes into the space program, his the son of Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev works for Chelomey's firm, so that gives him a little bit of an edge. Now, these three guys essentially come into the early 1960s as heads of incredibly powerful organizations. Korolev is the undisputed leader, but Glushko maybe has some sort of feelings of jealousy. He's the rocket engine guy, but he clearly is very important. Chelomey wants inroads into this whole business, so there's kind of jockeying for power. Now, they're obviously not the only individuals involved in kind of managing all this, and I do want to answer the question. Some people ask me who controlled the space program. Well, it wasn't Korolev who controlled the space program. There is no central organization like NASA. There's no NASA administrator. However, the control was sort of dispersed in a number of different areas, and there are political scientists who have very expertly, like Bill Barry, for example, who've expertly sort of disentangled this relationship. But I do want to mention a few people because they do sort of insert themselves into the story. If anybody could really be credited with heading the space program in the Soviet Union, it was a man named Dmitry Ustinov, who was a kind of bureaucrat, but a very, who'd earned his chops in World War II, was heavily involved in the defense buildup in the Soviet Union, helped develop these missiles and so on and so forth. Then there was Minister Sergei Afanasyev, who was supposedly 6'6" tall. They used to call him the big hammer. He's the classic, almost a cliche of a Soviet bureaucrat. Everybody's terrorized by him. Anyway, he heads essentially the space ministry. And then there's Mstislav Keldrich, who was the sort of consummate scientist, who was a brilliant scientist, applied mathematician, who did some of the mathematics for the Soviet hydrogen bomb program. But he comes into the space program giving some weight to the science, and he essentially has incredible influence over the Soviet space program. So there's three other figures that are playing something in this game. But the issue sort of becomes the Soviet space program essentially is riven by conflict. There's conflict over military and civilian goals because the same organizations have to build the missiles, then they have to build the spacecraft, so they have to learn how to allocate resources. And the government priority was essentially in the 1960s, better ICBMs to achieve strategic parity with the United States. And there's way more money for this, way more money. So if you want to survive in this cutthroat business, you essentially redirect your design bureau to building missiles, because that's where the contracts are. But the government also wants the space spectacular. So you have to sort of maybe thread a needle to really do both, because space spectaculars the government likes, but they don't really want to fund that much. There's also competition between the chief designers. I showed you a bunch of people: Korolev, Chelomey, and Glushko. There's severe personality conflicts that begin to essentially make inroads and encroach upon the functioning of the space program. And the most famous is probably between Korolev and Glushko, who are shown here in a very, very rare picture in the same photograph, because they were almost never seen together. It's said that they couldn't even stand to be in the same room. We see Korolev on the left with a smile, looking at Glushko on the right, sitting impassively staring into the distance, which in many ways, I think, encapsulates their relationship, and two sort of junior cosmonauts sitting in the middle. Now, Korolev and Glushko had a very tortured relationship since they were in their early 1920s. They had, let's put it this way, they had some bad blood. And this may have begun in the 1930s when both of them were arrested. These are the arrest photographs from 1938 under the Stalinist terror. Korolev was arrested in June 1938, Glushko a few months earlier, actually in March 1938. And Glushko, it is said during his testimonial to the NKVD, probably under threat of torture or even torture, incriminated Korolev. And later on, when Korolev was arrested, again, under threat of torture, and certainly he was in fact tortured, they broke his jaw, he also incriminated Glushko. So there was a kind of double betrayal going on, but under extreme coercion. So these kinds of things, I think, were never forgotten later in their life. I will say that they managed to work together through the 40s and 50s and building on Sputnik and Gagarin and so forth. They didn't necessarily, I don't think, despised each other early on in the 50s, but I think by the 60s, they were really at loggerheads. They just could not stand to be with each other. And it's kind of ironic because they, as young men, they had really both in the 1930s and the 1920s even, they had already started to dream about space. Korolev's very famous book from 1935, Rocket Flight into the Stratosphere, was a very landmark Soviet publication on high altitude flight. And Glushko already in the 1920s was already writing about space. He was, when this article came out in 1926, he was in his teens, actually. It was one of the first articles he published. And they were tapping into a kind of a much bigger Russian fascination about the moon, Soviet lunar dream. Soviets had dreamed about the moon for decades. This is not something they discovered in the 60s. From the 1930s, really. These are just some magazine covers I sort of put together, suggesting that there's a broad popular cultural interest in the moon that's circulating in Soviet society. They expect to get to the moon. It's not going to be a surprise. It's a given that the Russians will get to the moon. I was reading this article from 1957, How the Moon Will Be Conquered, which is in a magazine called Youth, again for kids, but very, excuse me, sort of very inspiring stuff about lunar travel and so forth. So all of this is, of course, in the backdrop of what's going on with the actual hardware. Where does this all begin? Well, this begins in 1961 with the announcement by John F. Kennedy of the goal of landing a man on the moon before the end of the decade. And again, was the speech is given on May 25th, 1961. And the question is, what did the Soviets think about the speech? And I've talked to a lot of people about this, and the general response seems to be it wasn't a big deal. It's just another speech. And why? Why was there no response? Well, think about it. In 1961, the Soviets had no reason to doubt who was first in space. They actually saw the United States as kind of weak. And so for a few years, they really didn't pay attention much to what was going on in terms of the gestational Apollo project that's building some momentum at the time. So initially, the Soviets kind of were not really paying attention to what was going on. And in fact, in the early 60s, there was some talk on the Soviet side of developing some super rockets. And they did basically get approved an idea for a rocket called the N-1, which was in September 1962. N for Nositiel, the Russian word for carrier. And this was essentially pushed through by Korolev. He was sort of anticipating down the road, maybe about a decade down the road, such a rocket would be useful, perhaps for crewed missions to Mars, perhaps for military goals. It was sort of all vague, but he knew that he wanted to get it on the books. And this project was approved at a very low level in September 1962. And one of the ideas they had was that this might, in the future, perhaps in the 1970s, launch a Mars vehicle, like some sort of heavy interplanetary vehicle. And these are sketches of such an idea from 1964. Well, all these sort of vague plans begins to suddenly change because back in the USA, back here, by the end of 1963, there's been 4 launches of the Saturn I booster, which is the precursor to the 1B. You have Apollo CSM LM contracts being handed out. You have John Hubble's very famous selection of lunar orbit rendezvous, the mission mode being selected. So there's quite a lot of activity, bustling activity. And we see a very definite shift in Korolev's thinking around late 63. A lot of studies being issued about a moon landing, which seems quite sudden, actually, if you track it. It's like around September, October, they begin to ramp up. And then in May 1964, there's news back in the Soviet Union that NASA has launched the first mock-up Apollo command service module on SA-6, which is also a Saturn I. And this I see in the documents from 64. Oh, what is going? They're actually building Apollo. So this begins to really throw them off, especially Korolev, who begins to get a bit obsessed about this, and he is a very driven person. So he arranges a meeting with Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union, on July 17th, 1964. And by the way, how do I know this? July 17th, I actually looked through the visitors logs of Khrushchev's office. And lo and behold, on 17th July 1964, at the bottom, on number 142, you say, Comrade Korolev met Khrushchev from 15:05 to 16:15 hours, probably in the afternoon, I guess, an hour change. So, and we have other documents to corroborate this. So he extracts a commitment that I need a full-scale national commitment for a response to Apollo. Korolev mobilizes a coalition of supporters, because that's what you need. It's not just Korolev's word that matters. Glushko's word matters, Chalamet's word matters, etc. But they can't seem to agree on who gets to do what. All these chief designers, they can only agree on the goal. They think the goal is worth doing, but they can't agree on who gets to do it, who gets a piece of the pie. So without really fashioning out these details, Korolev, who's sort of left alone now by him sort of trying to figure this out, on August 3rd, 1964, the Soviet Union issues a national commitment to a human lunar landing to beat the US. And this is a secret decree, which we have access to now from the archives. We can read what it says. And this is 3 years after Kennedy's speech. There's a clear invocation of Apollo in the document. Apollo is moving ahead. We must respond in kind. And so the architecture begins to slowly sort of play itself out at this point. The moon program is essentially split into 2 separate programs. One is a circumlunar project, whose deadline is 1967, which, why 1967? Well, October 1967 was the 50th anniversary of the great Bolshevik Revolution from 1917. So there's a clear mark. That's the first time we'll send cosmonauts around the moon. And then there's a landing project, which is more competitive with Apollo, and that's at the end of 69. And it's split into 2. Now, these programs have wildly different launch vehicles and spacecraft. There's no sort of commonality. So the one question one might wonder is, why are there 2 different programs? Well, one answer, and it's not the only answer, is that it's driven by personalities. There's a lack of unified coordinating body, such as NASA. There's no one person. Ustinov doesn't agree with Afanasyev, who doesn't agree with Keldysh. There's no kind of institutional apparatus to deal with these kinds of disagreements. So in the end, Korolev got himself the lunar landing project. But Korolev and Chalamet fought over the prime contractor role for the circumlunar one. And eventually, Korolev ousted Chalamet in 65. So for a year or so, Chalamet had the circumlunar project, but he was ousted in 65, and Korolev gains control over both. Now, in that year, Chalamet had actually built an enormous amount of ground infrastructure and even ground test articles for his circumlunar project, which I'm showing here. It's called the LK-1. Why am I showing this picture? Just to illustrate the level of waste that these guys essentially spent a whole year building and investing on a project that was completely shut down within a year once Korolev got the project back under his wing. And this happened repeatedly many times, by the way. So what was the circumlunar project about? What was Korolev's program? Basically, it's called L1. L is for Luna, the Russian word for moon. Basically, you take a stripped down Soyuz. Basically, you have the descent module, but not the orbital module. And you put two guys in it, and you put them on a proton booster, and it launches the L1 spacecraft on a circumlunar trajectory for about a week-long mission. It's fairly simple in architecture, but it does have to depend on the proton booster, which really hasn't flown that much. In fact, it's a brand new booster. They're just sort of test flying it. So that is really the critical weak link in all this. But the architecture is basically go up into Earth orbit and fire out of Earth orbit around the moon and back. There's not enough juice essentially to go into orbit around the moon with this setup. So it's a very simple, more of a, if you will, a propaganda kind of mission architecture. And this is what the Zond, which is eventually what it's called, the L1, looks like. As you can see, it looks like a Soyuz with its head cut off. The orbital module isn't there. It's just the descent module and the service module. And in the back end of it, you have a big booster stage called a Block D. So they start training cosmonauts for this project around 1966 or so. And eventually a prime crew is chosen, which is, here we see two members of the prime crew, Oleg Makarov on the left, who would be the flight engineer, and Alexei Leonov on the right, who would be the commander of this outbound circumlunar mission. In the middle, you have Nikolai Rukavishnikov, who was a backup. And these guys and a bunch of other cosmonauts trained really actively for this circumlunar project for about 2-3 years. So what ends up happening? Why didn't they end up going? Well, this program essentially, as I said, the goal was to achieve a circumlunar flight by October 1967, the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. But the goalpost was eventually moved. They knew let me back up. The goalpost was moved to the end of 68 because a catastrophe occurred in the Soviet space program in the spring of 1967, which was the death of Vladimir Komarov on the first Soyuz mission. So that threw everything into array. So they decided to essentially move the project back about a year to the end of 68. And the idea was, if we can fly 2 fully successful robotic missions, then we'll put a crew on the third one. That was always the sort of in the planning, and you see this in the documents. Obviously, it didn't happen. So let's go back. What happened and why didn't they do it? Well, you can see this record is pretty dismal. April 67, there's an upper stage failure. September 67, the Proton explodes, the first stage failure. Another Proton failure in November 67. This is a new launch vehicle that they just can't seem to master. March 68, you have a partial success but the reentry fails of the Zond. April 68, there's another Proton failure. So it doesn't even get to orbit. In July 68, there's a ground accident, and I believe 1 or 2 people were killed. I'm drawing a blank here, how many? So there's a lot of failure in the 67, 68 window with this program, the L1, which they're beginning to call Zond. Here we have some nice pictures. You can see the launch escape tower on the right, on top of the Proton. On the left is the Zond L1, the stack being assembled in the assembly building. And here we have the L1 Proton stack on the pad in Baikonur. And the right picture is the picture of a night launch. So we get closer to the end of 68. This is now September 1968. And I'm sure most of you know that the fall of 1968 is very busy for Apollo. In October 68, we see the flight of Apollo 7, and in December, Apollo 8, of course. The decisions in favor of Apollo 8 are taken sometime in the summer to essentially go to lunar orbit. Those decisions are eventually made public, and the Russians know those decisions, that Apollo 8, if Apollo 7 is successful, Apollo 8 will go for the moon. So there's pressure on them too at that time. In September, they launched Zond 5. What happens? It successfully flies around the moon, but it's supposed to do a guided re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. It goes ballistic. Now, it's still survivable, but it splashes down in the Indian Ocean instead of in the Soviet Union. So it's a success. It's the first fully successful circumlunar mission. So they need one more. What happens? In November and December, they have 2 launch windows, both in the early parts of the month. The crew is now ready. You have Alexei Leonov, Oleg Makarov. They've been trained. They're ready to fly the circumlunar mission. They have backups who are also ready to fly the mission. What happens in November is a catastrophe. Zond 6 flies. It flies around the moon, but on the way back, it essentially, it actually flies a guided re-entry, but it depressurizes, the crew module depressurizes on re-entry, which causes a parachute failure, and the descent module comes swooping down and crashes into the ground, into smithereens. So a crew would certainly have died. There's no question about it. It is a catastrophic failure. And because of that, the December 1968 launch is canceled. The early December 1968 launch. There's some talk among the cosmonauts, among Leonov, particularly Sevastianov, and there's an apocryphal story that they apparently wrote a letter to the Politburo pleading that they be launched in early December 1968, despite the failure of this previous mission. But I've never found any evidence for it, and it just might be hearsay. It's clear from the planning documents that immediately after Zond 6, December 1968 opportunity is canceled. We're not going to do it. It's too dangerous. And of course, we know what happens in December, Christmas 1968, Apollo 8 flies around the moon with Borman, Lovell, and Anders. And I found this very evocative quote from a Russian general just after that, when the Apollo 8 crew went TLI on December 21st, 1968. This is Nikolai Kamanin, who's on the left of this picture, sitting with Alexei Leonov, who might have commanded the first circumlunar mission, and his diaries of December 21st, 1968. The flight of Apollo 8 to the moon is a world historical event. It is a celebration of all mankind. But for us, this holiday is darkened by the realization of missed opportunities and regret that now it is not Bykovsky, Popovich, or Leonov who are flying to the moon, but Borman, Lovell, and Anders. So that kind of caps the circumlunar project, because after that, there's really no rationale for continuing, although it does continue sort of half-heartedly, and we'll come back to that actually in a weird way. But for the most part, its effectiveness, its political utility is gone. Which brings us to the lunar landing program, which is a bit more ambitious, far more ambitious, and in some ways, far more complicated story. The landing program involves a rocket called the N1, which I've introduced, and L3, a whole set of spacecraft, which forms a system which is on top of the N1. The N1 was upgraded progressively in the 60s, and by its final design, I've listed the stats here, I'm not going to read all of them. The numbers in red are the specs for Saturn V, so you can compare the N1 with the Saturn V. And one of the things that stands out, of course, that the ground thrust, if you will, of the N1 is above 11 million pounds, whereas for the Saturn V, it's about 7.7 million pounds. And yet the payload to orbit is very topsy-turvy. The N1 only gets about 165,000 pounds, Saturn V 260,000 pounds. And there's a clear answer for that, of course, because the Saturn V uses high energy cryogenic upper stage, the J1 engine, sorry, the J2, which uses liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen. And you can sort of compare a little bit the two vehicles, which, and you know, I can get into in the Q&A, but the development of the N1 in the 60s was very mired in problems. And I kind of organized my comments around a set of issues. The problem number one, and you may have heard this one, is that Korolev wanted to use cryogenic propellants, including liquid hydrogen, which are higher energy, provide more bang for the buck, and in terms of space activities, but are difficult to store on the pad. But he wanted to use sort of cryogenic propellants for all his new N1 class rockets. Now, Glushko, his erstwhile ally / enemy, refused, and he did not want to work with cryogenics. There's a natural question why. Part of the reason was Glushko had eyes on military contracts. The military did not want cryogenic engines on anything. They did not want to use liquid oxygen for anything. For the liquids, they wanted storable propellants, which were hypergolics. And Glushko had a whole slew of hypergolic propellant engines on contract, and he didn't want to divert those resources to start from scratch, which he'd never done in his career, work on liquid oxygen. So he just didn't want to do it. And so at that point, and Glushko actually even offered his own versions of hypergolic storable propellant engines, which Korolev refused. He said, I'm not going to use these on the N1. And those engines, by the way, ended up on the Proton. So lacking a collaborator for the engine, Korolev essentially went to a guy named Nikolai Kuznetsov, said, I need you to make engines for the N1. Kuznetsov was basically a nobody in the space program, although he had quite a reputation in the aviation industry because he was a builder of aviation jet engines. But he never built a rocket engine, but he had an idea for staged combustion engines, which are high performance engines, which nobody had built by the time, not even in the West, and then by the 1960s. In fact, a lot of Western rocket engine specialists thought this was not a way to go because it was too risky, et cetera. But Kuznetsov sort of staked his career on this, saying, I want to build these engines. So they were high performance, but they were low thrust. In other words, they weren't too powerful, but they were efficient for what they did. They were low thrust because Kuznetsov couldn't manage essentially scaling them up. Scaling them up meant a lot of other problems, instability, high pressure, et cetera, which he didn't have the resources to master. In the meantime, Glushko, having been sort of withdrawn himself from the project, allied with Chelomey to develop an alternate moon landing project called the UR-700. And they invest a considerable amount of resources in the very critical window of 65, 66, 67. It's as if during the height of Apollo and Saturn in the mid-60s, a company, I don't know, some company decides to get millions of dollars to fund a parallel Saturn project, a parallel to the Saturn project. And so you can imagine the disruption to that, both materially, but also psychologically. Problem number two, Korolev decided to skip ground testing, static testing of the complete first stage, which you see here. Why did he decide to do this? Well, there was no time and there's no resources. And so, as I said, money was really the key issue. But the other issue, which I've sort of recently discovered, is a lot of the static testing facilities in the Soviet Union, the really most advanced ones, were essentially controlled by Glushko, and he didn't want his stuff essentially to host N1 firings. So there's a lot of other problems that essentially led Korolev to just skip over that. This was one of the most risky decisions, and probably the most fatal one in my view, that crippled the project. No static testing of the full first stage. As you can see from this picture, the bottom of the N1 has exactly 30 engines of 150 tons thrust. There's a lot to synchronize. In order to do that, you need advanced computer systems, and the Soviet Union was not very advanced in the 1960s in doing that. They did develop a kind of an analog system called CHORD, which was quite, was capable enough. Like if, for example, one engine failed on the rim, the CHORD system would automatically switch off the opposite engine on the other side, and so forth, all sorts of variations of that. But the CHORD in flight proved to be extremely unwieldy and not very successful. And by the time they switched to a digital system in the early 70s, the N1 program was already winding down. The fourth problem I've already sort of gone over, that there's no unified commitment. The opposition from Glushko was really crippling. At times in 67, 68, Glushko wrote letters essentially trying to sabotage the project. The military was not interested in this. This was the least useful thing they could think of. And there's all sorts of quotes we found from marshals and generals saying this is a useless piece of crap, basically. I'm using polite language, but they said they used much worse language. So all of this is happening when Korolev is essentially selecting how to get to the moon and how to essentially send Soviet cosmonauts to the moon. The original plan was to use Earth orbit rendezvous, where you put together your set of spacecraft in Earth orbit and launch it towards the moon. But in 1964, the Soviets switched to Lunar Orbit Rendezvous, LOR, probably influenced by the NASA decision. In fact, I'm almost 100% sure it was influenced by the NASA decision. But I should mention, though, that there was a Russian theorist back in the 1920s, Yuri Kondratyev, whose real name is Alexander Shargay, who had suggested exactly such an option. So the Soviet scientists were actually familiar with LOR, and they were even in the early 60s had been discussing it, but they had abandoned it. But when NASA took it up, they sort of rescued it from oblivion again. And Shargay's story, by the way, is a fascinating story, which I want to get into because he had to change his name and his identity several times in his life for a variety of political reasons. So the architecture of the plan is we have a mothership and a lander. The mothership is the orbiter. It's a lunar orbital ship, or the LOK, and the lander, which is the lunar ship, which is the LK. It's much like the CSM and the LEM and Apollo are so the architecture is the same. This is the mothership, the lunar orbital ship, or the LOK, which looks like a souped up Soyuz, but it's actually quite significantly an upgrade from the Soyuz. The actual service module is entirely different from the Soyuz. It has a much more powerful set of engines. The life support system, radiation protection, all of that stuff is souped up. The avionics, attitude control is very different. It just physically bears a resemblance to Soyuz, but you can see size, in terms of size, it's smaller than the Apollo. And here's the lander, the LK, which I think this is a really interesting design. Also, it has basically it doesn't have two stages. Essentially, it's just one stage with and using the same engines to land and take off, and has a honeycomb structure at the flat struck panel at the top, which is the docking receptor for the LOK. So the mothership docks, and it's a single-use docking scheme where the probe essentially cracks the honeycomb and then sets in. And here we have the lander in comparison with the LEM, a nice picture of cosmonauts training on a mock-up, a ground mock-up of the lander. There's videos of this stuff on the internet if you want to check it out. So the overall technical approach was basically defined by the limited mass. Okay, so basically their N1 doesn't get enough mass to space. So that meant that they had the redundancy, if you will, had to be ensured without onboard backup systems because they couldn't be carried on board because there's not enough mass. A mass budget is too small. The LK is only about 12,000 pounds. The LEM is like 32,000 pounds. There's a lot you can carry on 32,000 pounds. So they kind of have to seek solutions that are risky, but kind of creative. There's a single cosmonaut in the lander. There's not two guys. It's just one person in the lander. The movement between the orbiter and the lander in Apollo, they go through there's the internal transfer hatch. For the Soviets, it's by EVA. So there's no complicated set of hatches and things that you just dispense with that. Of course, the risk is the EVA. The orbiter and lander has a single docking system, which I just talked about, this honeycomb system. So all you have to do is there's no kind of perfect aiming. It's just like a single docking system, and you discard the system upon use. The lander was a single stage system. The prime and backup engine for both landing and takeoff are the same. So they go through this set of questions, which I think will help us understand how they get to where they get to. They're like, basically, what if the LK lunar lander fails to lift off from the moon? What do we do because there's only one engine? So what they do is they use they say, well, we'll have a backup LK lander nearby. Okay, so that's the plan. So what if the backup lunar lander is too far to walk for the cosmonaut so they say, well, then we'll put a lunar rover on the ground to get the cosmonaut from the failed lunar lander to the backup lunar lander, which hopefully will be less than 5 kilometers. Okay. Well, what if the lunar rover fails? Well, we'll put a backup lunar rover on the surface. So this is the kind of thinking that they're going into as they're thinking about the architecture of the lunar landing project. Now, Korolev had been developing a lunar rover called E8 since the early 1960s. There's a version he pitches called EH2, which is adapted for the cosmonaut, and that is the source of what later becomes Lunokhod. So that actually comes out of the Soviet human spaceflight program. So the nominal lunar landing, the ideal version, is first they launch a bunch of support satellites into Earth orbit, for communications and radiation monitoring. Then they launched the first lunar rovers. Remember, there's two of them. So the first rover is launched by Proton to the primary landing site. It's just waiting there on the surface of the moon. A week later, they launch a second one to the reserve landing site. So now there are two rovers waiting on the surface of the moon, hopefully close enough to each other. About a month later, they launched a fully automated N1 stack with a fully automated LOK orbiter and a backup lander. And they basically land the backup lander by remote control near the second rover. So now they have a backup lander and a backup rover all set up. Then they use the rover to actually circle the lander to take photographs of the backup lander to make sure nothing's been damaged, its integrity is not compromised, etc. Then, about a month later, they launched the actual crew with the LOK and the LK into Earth orbit. LOK is the orbiter, LK is the lander. The basic flight plan is much like Apollo. There's a kind of, they spend some time in Earth orbit. They go TLI, translunar injection to the moon, except for the cosmonaut transfers are EVA. They don't have any internal transfer between the two. In lunar orbit, the LOK and the LK separate, and the LK descends down into the moon using an extra descent stage. The LK lands at the primary site near the primary rover. Then the rover, before the cosmonaut actually gets out of the LK, the rover circles the LK, makes sure everything's okay. And then the cosmonaut steps out onto the surface of the moon. And here we see an artistic representation of the cosmonaut on the moon with the rover nearby. Now, once he gets back in the lander, what if the lander fails to lift off? Cosmonaut gets out of the lander, gets on his rover, and drives to the backup. But if the LK does work, he gets in his lander and he lifts off, docks with the LOK, which is a standard Apollo kind of profile, except again, the transfer of cosmonaut and rocks will have to be by EVA, and then the LOK detaches and returns to Earth. So that's a very complicated set of things they have to do in order to have the landing happen in 1969. They basically overbuilt it with a bunch of support systems and things. And here's a drawing that is from the Soviet archives. This is from about 1968, 69. And you can see, it's all in Russian, but I put some English in there. On the left side, you can see a rover, the EA-2. And on the right side, the two landers. The LKE is the primary lander and the LKR is the reserve lander. So what the rover does on the left, it basically moves all the way, circles, explores and looks at the reserve lander, circles it, and goes to the primary lander. And if the primary lander is incapacitated, the cosmonaut can jump on the rover and drive to the backup rover. Anyway, so this is all happening, I guess, in their planning documents. Nothing is, of course, ever actually flown, but it is quite an interesting and ambitious set of mission operations when you start to think about it. And all of this is happening because they don't have enough mass to put redundancy on the spacecraft itself. Now, the question I've often been asked is, who is the first man in the Soviet case? Who would be the first man on the moon for the Soviet Union? People will always tell you it's Alexei Leonov. This was probably not true. The most likely person who might have been the first Soviet man on the moon was Vladimir Shatalov. Why do I say this? I won't get into it, but I can go into the Q&A. But Shatalov was the only person trained in docking by early 1969. He was a test pilot. He was extremely senior. He was older than Leonov. And he eventually took over the position that Deke Slayton had in the cosmonaut corps. Essentially, he picked every crew from the 70s and the 80s. He was extremely powerful and influential. And when I interviewed him, he expressed a great deal of resentment about Leonov claiming everywhere in every interview that he would be the first man. He said there's no chance that he would have been the first. Kamanin had essentially tapped him to be the first. So it's possible. These stories, still have to be figured out, but my money is probably Shatalov. Now, Sergei Korolev died in 1966. This is another huge blow to the Soviet space program. Here's a picture of Korolev with Kurchatov, who was the father of the Soviet atomic bomb. Kharlav's death left the program in complete disarray. He was succeeded as design bureau head by Vasily Mishin, his deputy. Mishin was a brilliant engineer, a lot of design solutions, but a terrible, terrible manager, and a little bit of an alcoholic also. So Mishin directed the Soviet moon program from 66 to 74, and this is where things go real south real fast. In 1969, after Apollo 8, it was clear that the US would get to the moon first. Excuse me. So the plan is, how do you beat the Americans when you know you're not going to make it to the moon? Is to overwhelm with smaller successes that take the edge off possible Apollo successes. But when it ends up happening is the first N1 launch in February 69 fails at about a minute and change after launch. The rocket explodes. So as you're getting close to the finish line, which is July 1969 and the Apollo 11, in May 1969, there's a big meeting of Soviet space program bureaucrats. And they kind of put together a plan, which I've only begun to discern in the last year or two from archival documents. The plan in May 1969 becomes, in June or July, to return lunar samples using a robot, the E85. And this is the report, the system E85 report, which is basically issuing a call to develop a lunar sample return system. In July, operate a remote control rover, which is the Lunokhod on the surface. In July, also launch a Saturn-class N1 rocket on a fully automated lunar orbital mission. And in July, late July, possibly launch a crewed circumlunar mission. Now, all of these things individually would pale in terms of Apollo 11. But put together, the idea is that there's a kind of dazzle. There's a lot of stuff going on. We got lunar samples. We put cosmonauts around the moon. We launched a Saturn V class rocket. We have a car on the moon. All of these things together would create the image of a very active space program that's not falling behind. And that's essentially the plan in May of 1969. So what happened? Well, I think we all know what happened. The second N1 launch in July 1969 was a catastrophe. The rocket lifted off a bit, and then all the engines were shut down by the coord system, and it collapsed onto the pad, destroying the entire pad infrastructure. In July, also, they launched a lunar sample returner called Luna 15, and as it was landing on the moon, it flew into the side of a mountain and was destroyed. And then, of course, you have Apollo 11, launched on the 16th of July, 1969, and the landing on the 20th. The lunar rover was never launched. And in August 69, kind of a pale whimper, really, they did launch a circumlunar mission. They didn't put humans on board. It was fine. It was successful, but nobody really paid attention to it. So this is the aftermath of the big May 1969 plan, kind of a fizzle. There were further launches of the N1 in June 1971 and November 1972. These were also failures, spectacular failures, although by the last launch, it had flown the longest and was almost to second stage ignition. I have a little video. I'll try to show it to you maybe just for a little bit while I talk through some issues. This is a video of the N1 that Roscosmos issued. I hope it's not freezing up or anything. If it is, somebody let me know and I'll stop it. But you can see them smashing a bottle of champagne on the rocket, much as ships are launched into the oceans. And the first N1 was going to be launched into the skies. And you can see the massive infrastructure built at Baikonur to transport the N1. There are the engines, the core 6 engines, the outer circumference of 24 engines of the rocket. This film, by the way, was commissioned specifically by Mishin to show the politicians in the Politburo that good work was being done. Here is the first launch on 21st of February, 1969. That's Boris Dorofeyev, who was one of the chief designers of the N1 rocket, and that's the launch. The launch lasts, as I said, a little over a minute, and and then here we have the second launch vehicle being assembled. This was going to be the big spectacular in July 69. So the big sort of dazzling with a lot of little things planned. And so this was really important that this be successful. Here we have some important designers. Again, Dorofeyev, who was a very key figure in then one, although not much is known about his life in the West. The launch escape tower. This was a night launch on the 3rd of July, 1969 from Baikonur. And you see the launch. And again, but within, you see the rocket collapse very quickly right after launch. And there we go. So it actually collapses right on top of the pad. And amazingly, no one was injured or killed in this explosion. And then back to the drawing board. This is the N1 assembly building. Let me just see. I guess this is the third one. Painted a little bit different. And this carried just a mock-up, and there was no LOK or LK on board. This one also collapses close to the pad, but not on the pad. So nothing was destroyed. And the fourth one, which I don't think this video has, is pretty much the same. So I think I'm just going to move on, and we can show it later if we want to. So so a couple of postscripts when I finish, because I have been going on for a long time. After all these failures, Vasily Mishin was fired for, understandable reasons, but he was also put under gag order that you can't talk about this at all. And he spent the later years of his life in the 80s and stuff, just kind of being a professor at the Moscow Aviation Institute. He was replaced by Valentin Glushko, Korolev's old rival, which is a sweet irony because Korolev would have hated that, but Korolev was long gone by then. Glushko's first act was to kill the N1 program. He destroyed all the hardware, all the blueprints. In fact, it's been a lot of trouble reconstructing the project because so much is gone. And by the time Mishin was fired, he had actually made quite a lot of progress on an advanced lunar base. These are little models that are on display in Moscow at a museum that would have essentially constituted a major moon base by the mid-70s, but Glushko killed that also. And the moon program was never mentioned in official sources until 1989. Although many Western observers did guess correctly that there was a moon program, although the Soviets repeatedly denied it through the 1970s and through the 1980s. And I just want to pay tribute to some of those who did figure out what was going on. Charles Sheldon, Jim Oberg, Jeffrey Perry, Philip Clark, Charlie Vick, etc., many other people. The first big interview with Vasily Mishin was published in Pravda in 1989. In which he sort of laments all the stuff that happened. I think it was kind of, he was holding all this stuff in for a long time. It's an interesting interview. And I think, and there's been a lot of course, written about the Soviet space program. I just want to maybe self-promote myself a little bit if I permit myself. This book came out, my book came out in the year 2000, thanks to Roger Lanius and the good people at NASA History Office. And we were able to have Vasily Mishin himself get a copy of this book before he passed away, which was quite a weird and strange thing to happen. But the other postscript is, of course, all these robotic missions continued that were actually built for the human lunar landing program. Lunokhod continued and successfully completed 2 missions in the 70s. And the sample returner, Luna, successfully recovered samples 3 times in the 70s. All of these projects were built to support the Soviet human lunar landing project. Another postscript was, people often ask me, what did US intelligence agencies know about the Soviet moon program in the 60s? US reconnaissance satellites such as Corona, Gambit, as well as SIGINT assets were key sources of information. The CIA, the NSA, and many other agencies followed key events in the project. And these are some declassified photographs of the N1 pad area with an N1 on the pad. They were aware very closely of the massive N1 explosion in 1969. There's some pros and cons of overhead reconnaissance. They got really good at it, basically, by the late 60s. They had excellent technical information, assessment of systems, etc. They had less information on the internal personal conflicts within the Soviet space program, and occasionally, in my estimation, overestimated the Soviet capabilities because they were assuming that the Soviets would do what we did, but they didn't. They often had more conservative solutions. And I highly recommend the work of Dr. Dwayne Day if you want to pursue this line of inquiry. Another postscript, almost there at the end. The N1 rocket engines, although Mishin was fired, he managed to store a whole bunch of these engines in storage. And they essentially came out of the cold in the 1990s. Aerojet purchased these engines for use on Orbital Sciences' Antares launch vehicle in the 90s, and they kind of upgraded them. They renamed them, and they were used as part of the COTS contract to launch the cargo ships to ISS. There were 5 launches in 2013, 2014. One of them, which was a terrible failure, and after that failure, Aerojet OSC, Antares stopped using these engines. They use another Russian engines now, Glushko's engines, which is another irony. But these engines are continuing their use for Russian launch vehicles. There's a Russian rocket called the Soyuz T-1V, which still uses the NK-33 engines built for the original N1. They're running out of the store, but 50 years later, they're still being used, which is amazing. Almost there. One summary slide. Why did the Soviets fail? Because that's an interesting question. One is for sure a late start. They didn't start in 1961. They had 3 years. They were 3 years behind, essentially. Another is lack of adequate funding. My guess, this is a real guesstimate, is about $12 billion on the moon program in US dollars, which affected the fact, because that's not enough money, you can't do ground testing, static testing of the first stage. There's also a lack of sufficient political commitment because the leadership of the Soviet Union is mostly interested in strategic parity, nuclear strategic parity, to be comparable to American military power, and not so much going to the moon. Poor management, there's no single management authority like NASA. Control is distributed at various levels. There's internal conflict. Personalities are toxic, in my estimation, their relationships. Too much competition, I don't know. Can there be too much competition? And finally, poor quality, poor quality control at the factory level. So you could be the most brilliant designer and design the most elegant object or gyroscope. But once it's time to build it at the factory, the Soviets had a lot of problem maintaining quality control. And related to that, fully automated systems, which the Soviets demanded, it took more time to develop. So I will leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening.
Asif, wow, that was great. Please don't apologize for running over.
Okay, thanks.
Before we get to the Q&A and while we wait for a couple of questions to come in, I just want to mention that Dwayne Day is on this talk. He's been watching it, as has Bill Barry, former NASA chief historian. And also the Niagara Frontier section, which was originally started in Buffalo, even though we're international and now we're in Ontario and Quebec. We have a very good relationship with the Kodak Research and Engineering Retirees Group, which are the gentlemen who made Gambit possible and the film, and quite a number of them are on this talk as well. And I'm sure they appreciated that plug for their film and their camera system on Gambit. First question, I was struck by the tremendous redundancy with the multiple landers and the multiple rovers that you outlined to ensure that the guy who landed on the moon would be able to make it back alive. How do you contrast that with the Voskhod 1 and 2 programs where, per your book, and I want to say it's a fantastic book, anyone out there, they took significant risks in order to beat Gemini for the first spacewalk and the first crewed mission?
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. I have struggled with this myself because the risks were quite outstanding in the early years. So what changed or what evolved? And my guess is that the death of cosmonaut Komarov in 1967 was a big blow to them, and they were when the Soyuz spacecraft on re-entry crashed and killed him. And I think they essentially, or when I say they, some of the leading engineers became wary that if a Soviet cosmonaut did die on the surface of the moon, it would be a catastrophe, a public relations catastrophe, a catastrophe of a greater level than imaginable. So they were essentially trying to fix that problem by using all these sort of band-aid solutions. But I do think this was probably anomalous in some ways, that I think there were others who resisted this piecemeal approach. And they were, I didn't share the whole story, but there were other engineers, unlike Mishin, who wanted to do this very complicated set of things. There were others who said, no, we should just send the guy and let the chips fall where they fall. So it wasn't a unanimous decision, but I think eventually I think they were very scared by the possibility of losing a cosmonaut on the moon, especially if American astronauts were making it safely back. So that's sort of my quick explanation.
Okay, we have actually a question from Dr. Day. You mentioned the plans to dazzle in June, July 69. Other than the big N1 failure, did they do other launches? Did they have things lined up that were not ready for that deadline?
Yes, hi, Dwayne. Again, good question. They did try the sample return. As you probably know, Luna 15 was launched a few days before Apollo 11. That was one of the dazzle components. So launch the N1, get a sample return successfully done, which they did tried, but it crashed on the moon. And the other ones they didn't launch. So I think they got cold feet. They were, I'm beginning to feel like they were very close to launching a Zond with a crew on board. And I found some discussion of that, but they got cold feet at the end. So I would say, a quick answer to your question, they kind of tried in a half-ass way, but not in a full way. But that was the plan. The plan was to, I think, I'm recognizing that it was a kind of a lot of small things to divert attention from the big thing. So, but I think once the N1 blew up, that was kind of the end of that plan, because there's, yeah.
Okay. We have a question that relates more to the US space program, but I'll throw it out saying, years ago I read the reason we stopped going to the moon in '72 was that the inertial navigation systems we needed for ICBMs were perfected. And that was really a cover for funding the lunar program, the Apollo program. Any comment on that?
Well, I have to
I've
differ.
Never heard that before.
Yeah, I have to differ with you on that. I don't think the reason NASA stopped going to the moon was a whole set of political issues and in fact, funding issues, those independent of those kinds of issues, what you were bringing up. So that, which is historians have written about the end of Apollo, why that happened, but already the NASA budget was already declining after 1966, and the Saturn V production line had closed down. So you have basically, and then by 1969-70, you have the further cancellations of later Apollos, 18, 19, 20. And so that sort of winds the program down. And of course, then the shuttle, et cetera. So it's there's a whole host of other reasons why Apollo gets shut down.
Okay, we have another one. The Soviets and the Russians seem to have a lot of luck with their Mir stations. Any comment on those?
Right. Well, this is about the 1980s. Yeah, I mean, they had Mir, I think, flew from 1986 to 2001. 15-year spread. A lot. The way I look at it is actually in many ways now. At the time, maybe not so, but I think of it as the kind of the first model of the car that you make that's kind of not really put together, that's sort of chugging along, breaking down a lot. I see it more as a kind of learning experience. and a lot, and the kind of in situ repair capabilities, having to deal with near catastrophes, those kinds of things. I put a spin on it, more of a glass half full kind of thing, that I think you gain a lot of experience in dealing with regular day-to-day space operations by dealing with emergencies like that. And ISS is, I think, a lot like that too. So,
okay. You mentioned that the whole Soviet space program shifted towards the moon in '64 when Korolev and Khrushchev met in secret and so on. What were their goals prior to that? What were their aims?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there was a major 1960 plan that they issued in June of 1960 for a long-range plan for the space program, which got derailed essentially by the 64 realignment. The 60 plan was large Earth orbital stations, assembling something like ISS almost, and ambitious plans to essentially send people to Mars and Venus. And lunar exploration too, but lunar exploration was sort of folded in as part of some larger thing. There was no, we're gonna, boots on the ground kind of moon program. So there was a kind of larger diffuse project of exploration, but really starting with Earth orbital stations, like a giant Earth orbital station, and slowly moving forward, outward. And that gets essentially folded back in '64 when all their eggs are put in we need to get to the moon basket, so to speak.
Another one, were there any repercussions against the people who worked on the Russian lunar program other than Michigan? Did people lose their jobs or positions for failing to beat Americans to the moon?
Yeah, that's a good question. Some did. Some were demoted. I know some people who were demoted, some people who were fired. And that's about the worst that happened. But nobody was threatened with anything more than that, which is also, I suppose, surprising. But in fact, in 1969, there was a chief designer who was fired, which was a big deal because of the sample return failures. But Mission in '74 is the really big figure who was fired. And he was also not only fired, but he was made excommunicado. He could not communicate with the terms of his firing were very severe, so he had to essentially go off. But there were some others also who were fired or demoted, but his was the most serious case.
Here we have a question from one of our Kodak R&E folks. Can you comment on Soviet photographic recon satellites in the '60s through the '80s?
Yeah, I would say in general, they're about a generation behind US ones. The Soviets heavily invested in film return technology, which was both recovering the large capsule with the camera and microcapsules that they would eject as needed. But they really didn't cycle from film return into digital systems until the 1980s, and even those were behind. And my sense is that it took a long time for them to catch up. They did eventually, but I think during the Cold War, I would say they're about a generation behind, at least. So it's not that they didn't have systems. Oh, the other thing I should mention is their systems were very short-lived. So it's not like you could put something, I don't know, like a long-term satellites like Canon or something up for a year or two. You would have things lasting a couple of months at the most. So they were replaceable and cheap. Yeah, that was their philosophy. You fly something, the whole system is built on cheap things that are expendable. And as somebody who might study sort of the ideology of innovation, it's not clear to me which is better in terms of the end user. Yeah. So, yeah.
Okay. We have a question referring to one of your slides. You posted a slide earlier of the LK3 upper stage of the N1, which showed a hand sketch next to a drawing. There were two large parabolic dishes shown on either side of those drawing sketches. Mm-hmm. What were the parabolic dishes used for?
I'm going to try and find this. I'm not actually sure, but yeah, let me try and find it if I can.
Sure.
But I'm guessing I don't know the answer to that question, but let me find it. We can go to a different question. I'll come back to it.
Okay. Another question is, does Russia have currently any ambitions to put cosmonauts on the moon? Have they undertaken a program to do so in the future?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that because they're now collaborating pretty actively with China. And the idea is that, well, let me back up. The Russian space program is a pale shadow of what it used to be in Soviet times. And that's a longer conversation, which we can get into for a lot of reasons. But my sense is that they're, you know, I always say this and I regret it every 5 years, I'll say this, but my sense is that they may be turning a corner. Not necessarily because of anything, but I think because they're beginning to pivot towards out of ISS slowly, maybe the next 5 to 10 years, and then moving into a different orbit, no pun intended, of cooperation with the Chinese. And I think that's a transition we'll see this decade. They have actually announced, the Chinese have announced that they're going to start building a station on a lunar base, I guess, on the surface of the moon from the early to mid 2030s. So still a while away. And Chinese representatives were in Moscow, I think last year, kind of securing agreements and things like that for that base. So it's entirely likely, I don't know, that it may actually happen, not because of the Russians, but because of the Chinese. I think if the Chinese say it's going to happen, it's probably going to happen. So I think that's probably one way in which a Russian gets to the moon, is through so that way. Now I have this picture. I don't know if, let me just, I don't know if this is the picture that the gentleman was talking about. Maybe not. Oh, that's it. Okay. There are two large parabolic dishes shown on either side of these drawings, right? What are those used for? You know, your guess is as good as mine. I don't know. These, as I said, these are deep space vehicles to go beyond Earth orbit, probably Mars orbit, or that level of distance. So if you're a telecommunications expert, you might know what kind of antenna. Solar dynamic. Oh, Glenn, I'm sorry, I didn't even realize that was you. Hi, Glenn, because it's hard to see that now. You know, I'll do some research on this because the reflectors aren't in the legend. The Russian language isn't telling us what they are. So, but I'll do some research and I'll find out. I'll get back to you. But thanks for asking that question.
Okay, we have another question just came in. A few years ago, the capsule escape system designed more than 4 decades ago saved the life of both a Russian cosmonaut and an American astronaut when the Russian rocket had an anomaly. Was this the same emergency system used in the late 60s and early 70s?
Yeah, I mean, conceptually, it basically is the exact same system. I mean, I'll say this, I'll come back to the launch escape system. One of the things that's incredibly surprising to me, maybe not surprising, impressive to me, is the robustness of the Soyuz design, all of it. You know, this is something that was designed in 1961-62. The shape of the Soyuz capsule, its launch escape tower, the system, the 3-module system, the curve of the heat shield, its ability to do guided reentries, ballistic reentries in off-nominal situations. And this is what Korolev designed, and Feokhtistov and a bunch of other guys. I'm actually amazed by the robustness of the design, that it can accommodate so many off-nominal situations and still save the crew. It's not very comfortable. It's not the best thing. It's not a limo. It's not anything, but it does get the job done. And the launch escape system is a perfect example of it. It is incredibly reliable. I don't think, in fact, I was looking at stats. I don't think it's ever failed. Which is an extraordinary statistic. Although, of course, the fact that you have to use it is another question. But nevertheless, it is a very robust system, and it is essentially the same system that was used in 1975 and again in 1983.
Okay. We have another question. Apollo supported a number of scientific experiments that were deployed by the astronauts. Was the small Soviet lander, was the intention to support boots only?
Excellent question. Thank you so much. Yeah, I've been trying to dig into that. There was a experiments package, and I've seen pictures of it. I don't know much about it, but yes, there was a small, compact experiments package that was designed by the Institute of Space Research. There was also talk of seismometers. I was drawing a blank on the word. I note that there was a contract given for a small compact seismometer to be carried on the LK. The problem, as I mentioned, is that the mass budget was so tight that they couldn't get stuff on. But there was also some talk, I'll add this one last thought, which was that to have some of these scientific experiments on the Lunokhod rovers. So once the cosmonaut gets to the moon, he has access to the rovers, which have a science package on them. And so that was the other option explored.
Okay. I'm going to ask perhaps one last question if we don't get any more, and maybe also do a plug for your book. I've given talks on Gemini, and everything I have in there where I talk about the Soviet competition from Gemini with Voskhod 1 and 2 is from your book. Fantastic, fantastic descriptions.
Thank you.
In 2 or 3 minutes, could you discuss, for example, the compromises that the Soviets made that are documented in your book with Voskhod 2, say, to have a spacewalk before Ed White?
Wow, yeah, a lot. Well, first of all, there's no launch escape system on the vehicle the rocket as it's taking off. For the first, I forget how many seconds. If something happens to the booster, it's curtains. So that's the first compromise, so to speak. There's the whole airlock system is untested. It's a very sort of it is a really makeshift system. It's almost glued together. It actually is physically glued together onto the Vostok module, which becomes the Voskhod. So I think the airlock system is a second level of weakness. The third is, of course, the re-entry and landing, which they have. They were with the Vostoks. They had this idea that if the re-entry engine failed, the spaceship would naturally decay after 10 days, and they had enough life support to do that. With the Voskhod, if the re-entry engine failed, there's two guys. They would, in 10 days of normal, we wouldn't even get to 10 days because they would just be dead after a few days. So they had to build an extra engine, and they built this very rudimentary extra engine, which was deeply problematic and wasn't work. It was very new, basically. So I think that engine was another weak point. They didn't have to use it. And finally, as you know, with the Vostoks, they ejected out. Gagarin ejects out and parachutes down. With Voskhod, with Leonov and Belyaev, they can't eject out because there's two guys. There's no ejection seats in the capsule, so they have to come down with the capsule. Now the capsule comes down really hard. In fact, it's not survivable. So the problem becomes, how do you make this thing survive? So they put underneath the parachute, they actually put an engine, which essentially it's called the parachute reactive system. It essentially slows the thing down, which is highly dangerous because it's above the capsule itself. And so this is another weak point which could have gone wrong in so many different ways. It worked twice, and I think that's when they decided that we're not going to try this anymore. And they had plans for Voskhod 3, but it was the mission had a crew, had a whole everything ready. But I think a few weeks before the launch, they said, we're not going to do this anymore. And they move on to Soyuz, and that's what happened.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's we don't have any more questions, and 8:30 is our normal cutoff time, so you nailed it. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
I'd like to remind everyone, if you have any follow-up questions, send them to nf.aiaa@gmail.com, like I said in the beginning. But it was truly a pleasure, Dr. Siddiqi.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, and maybe we'll have you again back sometime on another variation of the Soviet space.
I hope so. I hope so.
Okay. And Bill Barry says, great presentation. I think you see that. Thanks, Asif.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
Take care,
All right.
everyone. Have a good
Okay.
night. See you in March.
Good night.